Welcome, everybody. My name is Mark Nutter. I'm the grants manager at New Hampshire Audubon, where I've been working for almost 2 years now. And this evening, I am the self-proclaimed webinar czar. We will be recording this event, so please go ahead and mute yourself to enhance the recording. In a moment, I will describe how you can ask the speaker questions during and after the presentation. To try to make this event as in-person as behind a screen can really be, please consider leaving your video on during the presentation and, importantly, during the Q&A section afterwards. Thanks for joining us in the second of our series of talks focused on pollinators on this rainy fall evening. I would like to take this opportunity to briefly describe how this webinar fits into the larger mission of New Hampshire Audubon. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that is completely independent from National Audubon. We rely on members and donors just like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 main pillars: connecting people to nature through environmental education, researching and conserving species in peril, managing over 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation, and advocating for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire State Legislature. I'm here today because of our donors and members that support us. I'd like to specifically thank the Coswell Benevolent Trust, the Benjamin Couch Trust, and the Gertrude Couch Trust for their specific support of this webinar series and the educational initiatives in the pollinator gardens. We also have a huge network of over 2,000 volunteers that assist us with wildlife monitoring, ambassador animal care, environmental education, and wildlife sanctuary management throughout the state. If you are a volunteer, member, or supporter of New Hampshire Audubon, I'd like to thank you for your support. If you would like to become a member, volunteer, or supporter, please check out our website for ways to get involved. And although tonight's webinar is free of charge, please consider going to nhampshire.org/donate to make a donation. And although this is not your first Zoom, a quick review of some of the features that we'll be using to mute and unmute. It's this microphone. Same with the start and stop video. And then what Linda did earlier through the participants tab, it jumps over to here, and you can raise this blue hand that shows us that you have a question, and we can call on you and unmute you to ask your questions live in the Q&A section, or throughout the presentation, you can ask your question at any time using the chat feature right here. And then the final note is just the speaker view. And that you can change it into gallery view and move people's heads around so it supports your webinar experience. And now I'd like to turn it over to our series organizer, Diane DeLuca. Diane has been a senior biologist with New Hampshire Audubon for over 30 years and has many roles here, including playing a pivotal role in the restoration of breeding tern populations along the New Hampshire seacoast. As with all careers, hers has morphed along the way, and now she pioneers the organization's effort to establish and educate others about the importance of pollinators, as well as leading many phenology and wildlife monitoring projects around the state. In her current role, she manages all activities in the McLean Demonstration Pollinator Garden, including the vast volunteer effort it takes to maintain those gardens. She has also organized this speaker series to bring some of the region's experts directly to you. So without further ado, Diane DeLuca.
Thanks, Mark. And thanks to Mark for making this webinar possible with his expertise in getting everyone online and a cheerful face of New Hampshire Audubon. I live in an area with poor connectivity, and there are many silver linings to living in the middle of a large piece of protected land, but connectivity is not one of them. So I'm here, and you can actually see my face in my black box, but I don't have enough connectivity to have video. So I really appreciate Mark being the guru, as he says, and the expert in technology. So very thankful to him so that we can offer this series. And thanks also to Vicki Brown for her willingness to share her knowledge of landscaping practices that benefit pollinators and wildlife in your own backyards. New Hampshire Audubon is very grateful. So our speaker, Vicki Brown, and I guess some of you know her from what I heard as you joined the program. Our speaker, Vicki Brown, is a New Hampshire natural resource steward, a Pollinator Pathways New Hampshire co-founder, and a member of her town's Conservation Commission. She is slowly turning her lawn into pollinator and wildlife habitat and enjoys observing nature while walking, hiking, paddling, and cycling. She shares nature observations on Instagram and has written a number of articles that include Who Are the Pollinators?, New Hampshire Super 7, How to Attract Hummingbirds to Your Yard, How to Help Bees and Butterflies Survive the Winter. And I'm sure she can tell you how you can connect to some of those articles. So tonight she will be sharing her expertise through a presentation entitled A Garden for Pollinators and Wildlife, Natural Landscaping for a Better Yard. This program is sponsored by Speaking for Wildlife, which is a volunteer project of UNH Cooperative Extension and New Hampshire Fish and Game. So we're very appreciative to have Vicki tonight. So there's a special offer tonight for those of you who are inclined to fill out evaluation surveys. A survey will be sent to each one of you at the end of the program to give you an opportunity to share your thoughts on the presentation. And we appreciate hearing from you as to how we can improve this webinar series. And so tonight, there will be one winner randomly selected in a drawing who will win one of these 3 books, and it will be your choice. So Nature's Best Hope by Doug Ptolemy, Bringing Nature Home by Doug Ptolemy, and I'm sure that you'll hear more about Doug Ptolemy from Vicki as she goes through her presentation, and Integrated Landscaping, which is a book that was put out by UNH Cooperative Extension. So Vicki, thank you. We're very excited to have you and really appreciate learning more from you.
Great, thanks Diane. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it. As Diana said, my name is Vicki Brown, and it's a pleasure to see some old and some new friends here tonight as we talk about ways that you can landscape your property, not necessarily your backyard, but this is beautiful enough to be in your front yard as well. How can you landscape your property to attract pollinators and wildlife? So I am doing this program as a volunteer. UNH Extension and New Hampshire Fish and Game have a Speaking for Wildlife program with 7 different programs. This is one of those. So it's my pleasure to be able to share this information with you and looking forward to your questions. So I'd like to start with a story about why I'm here. Why did I become a volunteer, and how did I get here to do this? And it starts with a little black-capped chickadee. So I moved to New Hampshire 4 years ago, and my husband gave me a challenge of attracting hummingbirds. And in the process of trying to figure out how to do that without just putting up a feeder, I took an ecological landscaping course through Massachusetts Audubon at Ipswich River. And in that course, I learned to my dismay how many caterpillars a nest of chickadees needs. Does anybody want to guess? Many of you have heard this already, but each chickadee, mom and dad, bring a caterpillar to the nest every 3 minutes. They do this from 6 a.m. to 8 p.m., 14 hours a day. That's more than 500 caterpillars a day. And they do this for 16 to 18 days, depending on the fledgling time, which means 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars are required for 5 tiny little birds to fledge. And that's before they become adults. They're still going to be fed by their parents, like many birds are, after they get out of the nest. I learned this and I was shocked, and I was a little panic-stricken, to be honest with you, because with my 2 acres, I told my husband I didn't think there was any way in the world that we could possibly have that many caterpillars to even support a single chickadee nest. And that concerned me. So that launched me into what has become a wonderful pastime and hobby. It consumes me when I, at all times, just thinking about and learning about nature, this little chickadee. And I'm going to come back to the chickadee again later on in the talk, but that's kind of my spark bird, or my spark animal, if you will. Many of you have one that caused you to become a birder. This was really the one that caused me to really rethink how I look at my yard in a different way. So I'd like to ask a question of you. And if you could please share with us the answer to the question of, besides birds, because I know most of you are birders here. Oops, I'm giving you the wrong question. Let me give you the other question. Okay, so polling question number 1 is, besides birds, what wildlife do you most want to support on your property? And you get to pick, I think you can pick more than one. And just let me know what it is you're looking to attract primarily. That would be helpful. And while you're doing that, and I can see the results here, I can also let you know that any one of the things on this list, with some of the techniques that you're going to learn and the tips today, you'll be able to attract all of these different types of critters to your property. So I think that we have had, well, people are still voting. We have 51 votes in so far. So, wow, this is really, really exciting. I'm going to close the polling because all but 10 of you, I believe, have voted. So I'm going to show the results. And not surprisingly, since this is part of a pollinator series, most of you are interested in bees and butterflies. And some of you are interested in others, including all the above. So we will talk a lot about pollinators and insects as well as other animals. Thank you very much for sharing that. So, let's see. All righty, let's move on. Now, so if you're interested in attracting bees and butterflies and other animals, what is it that they're looking for? Well, we all know from high school biology that it's habitat. And habitat consists of 4 things, right? It's food, it's water, shelter or cover, and space. Space that they can live in, and space that they can breed in successfully. Those are the 4 components of habitat. And I'll be talking about how you can make changes in your yard that will affect each 3 of those 4, actually. What I'd like to do is kind of set the stage for what our yards look like for the most part in the United States today. You can see here a typical lawn in a typical residential area. And this is not at all appealing to wildlife. There's very little shelter here, except maybe in the boxwoods. There's no food to be seen and no water. And what's more is that there's not a lot of diversity of plants around. So the lawn itself is only 1 species in this vast monoculture area. It's also cut way too short at probably 1 inch. You see the bushes have not been pruned, but they've been sheared. And the mulch that is around the yard, particularly on that tree, unfortunately, is going to cause, rotting at the stem, and it's going to smother the roots, which need oxygen. That's called volcano mulching. If your landscaper does it, don't. That is going to kill the tree. So this is not the way that we recommend you attract wildlife to your yard. This, however, is another person's yard, and this is what we call natural landscaping, or ecological landscaping, which is actually the name of that course that I took. Ecological landscaping thinks about kind of following nature's lead. And if you look at this, to our eyes, it's very comforting, isn't it? What do you see here that you like? If I look at this, I see a nice path and I see a nice place to go, and my eyes drawn toward the bench to sit down. But I also see flowers. I see different layers. I see texture. I see coniferous, like a spruce or something in the background, and then I see deciduous trees. There's probably water somewhere. There's different ground covers. There's a lot going on here. And there's a lot of diversity here in plant life that's going to support many different butterflies and bees and insects, etc., many different animals. So that's natural landscaping. And what I'd like to do is talk about 3 of the 4 areas of habitat in some detail in our talk tonight. First food, then shelter, and then water. The space issue is a little bit harder for you as an individual to manage unless you're able to buy the property or conservation land next door. So we'll focus on these three. So first, if you have bushes and trees in your yard, or if you're adding them, we highly recommend that they have food on them of some sort. It can be fruits, nuts, berries, seeds of some sort. They all feed different kinds of animals. And that's a relatively easy thing to do as you add new plants to your yard. Besides perennials, think about adding shrubs and other kinds of trees and bushes that are going to provide food for the birds. And they also provide food for, when they flower, for our pollinators. Speaking of pollinators, we all know that they need flowers because they're looking for pollen and nectar. So that's a pretty easy fix, right? To add some flowers. But there's many different kinds of pollinators. In the survey, we asked about butterflies and bees, but there are actually 7 different types of pollinators in New Hampshire. And here's a picture of 6 different types. And the one that's missing is wasps. Wasps, actually, many of them are like the flower flies. They're pretty harmless to us, even though they may look large and scary. And they are very effective pollinators as well. We do have a lot of native bees in the state. In the country, I believe we have 4,000 different types of native bees and a couple of different families. But in the state of New Hampshire, we have 140 different bees, possibly more, but that's how many we know we have. If you were on Heidi's pollinator Zoom 2 weeks ago, you know how many butterflies there are in the state of New Hampshire. She said 139. So roughly the same number of native bees and butterflies in the state. What's interesting that people don't realize is how many moths we have. It's not just a few times more the number of butterflies. It's actually an order of magnitude higher. We have 2,200 moth species in the state. And moths are very important, not only as pollinators, but like all of the insects, provide many other important ecological services for us. So if you're doing flowers, UNH Extension highly recommends that you start with a 4x4 plot and that you try to make that preferably the same kind of flower. If you think about a pollinator, you want to try to minimize the amount of flying they have to do to get forage, to get the food that they need, because that's using energy. So 4x4 plot. The other thing that's really important is to think about providing food throughout the seasons. So you want 3 seasons worth of flowers. So that means that in the spring, you can have some native plants like, trout lily, foam flower, Canada Mayflower. You can also plant very successfully one of my favorites, which is the native columbine, which is red. It flowers early in May, and it's one of the hummingbird's favorite flowers. So that's spring. For summer flowers, we all think about things like milkweed, common milkweed, but there are 2 other milkweeds I would like to encourage you to consider, which are very well behaved in your garden. One is the butterfly weed, which is orange on the left, and the other one is a swamp milkweed. Both of these are really terrific plants in the summer. They don't support just the butterfly babies. They also support many other species besides monarch caterpillars. And I also love the vine that is, for some reason, not well known in the area, but it is our native honeysuckle. And our native honeysuckle has these beautiful red and yellow blooms, and again, is a hummingbird favorite. So those are some summer blooms, and I can say the coral honeysuckle keeps blooming. I still have blooms on mine. In the fall, there's some of the native plants that you can let grow around your yard that will just naturally grow are many different types of goldenrods and asters. You can also plant those, and there are, many asters are in the shade. They don't have to be in the sun. Sneezeweed, autumnal sneezeweed is another great one. And when you're thinking about the fall, that's also the time when a lot of the seeds and the nuts and things are coming, berries are ripening and coming from trees. And many of the pollinators are getting ready to go into the next phase. They're starting to think about overwintering, their mating and going to that next stage. So it's very important to remember to be very careful with chemicals that you're using throughout the year as well. So I talked about flowers, and we know flowers are great for adult butterflies and flowers are great for bees. But what about the babies? This is a monarch caterpillar. Most of you are very well familiar with this because we all plant milkweed for the monarch. And why do we do that? We do that because the monarch caterpillars require milkweed. There is a relationship that has, evolved over time between a monarch caterpillar and that plant. And that relationship is singular. A monarch caterpillar cannot thrive and will not become an adult if it doesn't have milkweed. And what's interesting is that this is not unique in the insect kingdom. Pollinators, butterflies, and moths all have these plants that they require, and it is unique to them. On the left is a black swallowtail caterpillar. Its native is a Zizia aurea, that's a golden Alexander, or anything in the parsley or carrot family, because that's all in the same family. It requires those plants to feed on, or again, it won't become a butterfly. Similarly, we have one of the many tussock moths. This one requires hickory. If it doesn't have hickory, it can't feed and it won't become an adult. So host plants is what we call these when the larva of a butterfly has to have a particular plant. It's its host plant. And as you get more into this, you can actually start thinking about, and you can find lists online of a certain butterfly that you might want to attract to your yard. You can find out what the host plant is. And Doug Tallamy, who Diane said you would hear about, and she was correct, Doug Tallamy has done a lot of research on this. He's an entomologist who studies caterpillars, and he can tell you that the longest it ever took for his target butterfly to show up on a host plant was 7 years. Most of the time, the butterfly caterpillars and the butterflies show up the year after the plant has been planted, which is pretty amazing. So host plants are also known as native plants. And native plants, we can argue about how, people will say, what is a native plant? It's something that's been here since the colonialists were here. And people will say, well, it's been here, almost as long as that, so it's okay. Think about it this way. And I've just come to this realization myself in the last few months. It's not about the amount of time a plant has been here. It's the ecological service that it provides. Does that plant actually have a relationship in an ecosystem with other flora and fauna? So does that oak tree support that caterpillar? Well, then that's a host plant, and that's native because that caterpillar is local to our area. So while I'm on the topic of native plants, I can't resist sharing with you the fact that some of the most important host plants are not flowers at all. It's not about flowers, it's about trees and shrubs. Our most productive caterpillar trees or caterpillar plants are actually trees. And I'm going to share with you the number of species that an oak can support. More than 500. 534 species of moths and butterflies can survive and live off of oak. The second tree is the willow. The willow can support 456 species of Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies. Plum cherry, 456 also. And birch, our native birches, 413. We have 4 trees right here that support more than 400 species of caterpillars. And willow, we know a willow is an early, spring flower, so it's also providing the benefit of forage for the early bees, like the mining bees, right? So speaking of bees, what's interesting is that they also are specialists. It turns out, some of the research being done by Heather Holm in the bee world, that many bees also, many of them are generalists, and they can get nectar or forage off of different plants, but some of them, because of the way they are built and the way that they have evolved, they require a very specific plant. And this is where the work that Diane is doing in phenology is so important, because if there is a mismatch between the timing of a plant and its flowering, and it comes earlier because of climate change or whatever, and the timing of when the bee or the butterfly comes out is wrong, it doesn't have its ability to get the food it needs, it won't survive either. So I encourage you to attend the next webinar which Lisa Wise is going to be talking about climate change and its impact on pollinators. So I'd like to illustrate this native plant, host plant concept with a real tree. This is actually a native dogwood, Florida dogwood, the red tree in the background, and it's a great tree. It's native and it's supporting life. It is supporting 117 different species of moths and butterflies in the caterpillar stage. So that's great. That's wonderful. If you have a dogwood in your yard that's from China, like the Causa dogwood, which I have in my yard actually, it supports zero Lepidoptera species. So again, thinking about it from a diversity standpoint, scientists believe that a native plant will support 29 times more types of life than an exotic plant that did not belong here, did not grow up with, did not evolve with the fauna, the animals, the pollinators and things that are here, 29 times. That includes big animals and caterpillars. It also includes microorganisms as well as things like mycorrhizal fungi that might be in the soil. So that's a pretty stunning number, 29 times more life. If we're looking to help restore nature in some small way in our yards, I definitely encourage you to please consider planting native plants. So I told you I'd get back to the chickadee, right? Here's a chickadee with one of those 600 caterpillars in a day. And I can say, I'm very happy to say that 3 years after my awakening, we now have, I think, 8 different types of birds now nesting in our yard, in our 2 acres. I'm very pleased to say we have a lot. We do have some trees that were there. Obviously, I couldn't plant trees, but really doing some things like not using chemicals and providing water and adding more native plants has made a huge difference. And caterpillars are very important to the ecosystem because they not only turn into the pollinators we all want to see, but they also provide this incredible food source. And we may not see as many monarch butterflies because, you know, something's eating the monarch butterfly, but that's part of the food web. That's part of the ecosystem. And that's what we really need to try to bring back. So it's kind of like you have more caterpillars, you're going to have more butterflies. You're also going to have more birds. And I can tell you, we definitely have more birds in the yard. And because we have more caterpillars, we also have lots more other animals as well that we didn't have before either. So as we're going through this, I would like you to be thinking about one thing that you can do in your yard based on what you learned tonight, one change that you'll make. And I'll ask you to tell us what that is at the end, okay? I also want to talk about the other non-pollinator types. If you have insects in your yard, you're obviously going to have lots of different animals, prey, that are going to be attracting predators. And some people don't want to attract predators, but I can say unless you have a very large property, it's likely that they will be passing through. You probably won't be living there. But this is an example of a healthy ecosystem. You can have this on your property as well. Maybe not the water, we'll talk about water in a minute, but you can certainly provide many different layers and kind of biodiversity that's here to attract the pollinators that you want. So that's a little bit about food. Before I jump into the next section, I'd like to pause for a moment and see if you have any questions that I can answer at this point. Diane, do we have any questions in the chat?
We do, Vicki. There are a number of them. Are native plants that have been hybridized still valuable to native wildlife?
Okay, so that's a very good question. And honestly, there's still a lot of debate about that. Doug Tallamy talks about that. He gets that question every time he does one of his presentations. And there are many people who believe that the cultivars or nativars, the ones that have been hybridized, are not as effective because they don't provide as much nutrition. Certainly, if we are hybridized, if we are making a cultivar that's for example, a rose of Sharon that becomes a double flower and the target pollinator can't get in there to get the nectar or pollen anymore, clearly, that's not a good plant. If you change the color, that's going to change what's ingrained in that bee or that butterfly in terms of how they look for a target flower. So there are some changes that definitely do not work as cultivars or nativars. And there are other changes that may be okay, but we don't have the science behind that to be sure. So my recommendation always is, when in doubt, go for the straight species. Don't get a cultivar or a nativar. But if you don't have a choice, it's better to plant the nativar or cultivar than to do nothing.
Here's a question that kind of feeds off of that one. I've heard that shrubs like the burning bush and barberry aren't good for birds. Could you explain why?
That's a good question. I'll actually talk about invasives, and those are two that we will talk about. Think about it there's two pieces of this. One is that there may not be any food for them, but there might be, but there aren't going to be any caterpillars on those because they're not native to the area. So there won't be any food for the birds, for one thing. But the other thing is that that bush that's taking up room is going to be spreading its seeds and taking up more room. And in places like forests, things like barberry and burning bush. In fact, I was in my town forest this morning. We have a lot of burning bush that's starting to spread. What happens is that even the deer won't eat it. They won't eat barberry. And the entire understory gets taken over by these non-native plants. So what you're doing is you're excluding the opportunity for there to be food or shelter for our native species. So there's two ways I think that it does hurt birds.
Here's a pretty general question, but what kinds of pollinators are best for gardens?
I would say that every pollinator is beneficial in some way. I think you get to decide which ones you want to attract. And I don't think there's any bad pollinator, just as there's a few bad insects that we don't like, but I honestly don't have a problem with, I love the beetles, the goldenrod soldier beetles, the lightning bugs. That was a lightning bug that I showed. Those are great to have, and they come to the swamp milkweed. The golden digger wasp comes to the swamp milkweed too. I would say there is no bad pollinator in a garden. And Diane, do you have a comment on that? Because you do gardens. You have a beautiful garden there at Massabesic.
I think I would answer it exactly the same way that you are answering it, and that any pollinator is beneficial. And if you can attract it to the garden, that's great.
Good. Okay.
So I would have the same answer. There's another interesting question here that I'll share. Should you not use bird seed?
I think that's a philosophical question. I do use birdseed. I certainly do. Phil Brown of New Hampshire Audubon says the same thing. He says, I like seeing the birds. I'm going to attract them. I like to see them. I think that the studies that have been done, if you read the scientific literature, or you listen to the field guides, or some of these other science-based podcasts and shows, that the research shows that most birds, even though they seem like they're at your feeder all the time, they don't get more than 10% of their nutrition from your bird feeder. They much prefer the insects, that they can get in the summer to the mealworm that you might provide them. However, your bird feeder could save their lives if we experience extreme weather that's very cold for a long period of time and they can't get food. It could save their lives because they need to get energy every day, or they will freeze to death at night. So that's where bird feeders are especially helpful, is in the winter. So I think what we'll do is move on to the next one now. Is that okay, Diane?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for your questions. Keep them coming in. So let's talk about the second area of habitat, which is shelter or cover. Why would an animal need cover? Well, obviously they're getting away from predators. They might be getting away from us if we're walking by. They're also really looking for cover from the elements, whether it's raining like it's been today, it's snowing like it will tomorrow, or it's really, really hot. An amphibian, for example, needs to keep its skin moist and and it's going to want to find shelter to get away from the heat. So shelter and cover provide a lot, are necessary for a lot of animals. And they're also critical when you have young, because they're typically kind of helpless and you need to protect and hide them. So I'm going to share some wonderful ways that are pretty easy, honestly, very easy, that you can add shelter to your yard and increase pollinators and other wildlife. The most important one, I think you saw visualized in that picture of that naturally landscaped yard. It's the layers. It's just the layers. It's just different levels. We don't often think about it in our yards because we're used to having grass and then trees and maybe a few bushes, boxwoods or whatever. But if you look in nature, in a place where it hasn't been overgrazed by deer or overbrowsed by deer, you will see that there's at least 5 layers in a forest or in woods. So you naturally have the ground cover, which in the woods could be like partridge berry. In your lawn, it could be wild or barren strawberry, right? You have the next layer above that, maybe it's ferns, maybe it's an herbaceous perennial of some sort. Then you have perennials. Then you have shrubs and subshrubs. And what do you have above the shrubs? You have the understory trees, things that thrive in the shade like hazelnut, spice bush. And then of course you have your tall trees. And those are all layers that we can play with in our yard and make them, you know, aesthetically pleasing and really beautiful for us, and also really functional for nature. Because every part of nature is looking for something different. You know that, for example, we know that we find scarlet tanagers at the top of the canopy. We know cardinals are always in the bushes, and owls are typically in evergreens. Bald eagles like the very top of the tree, you know, of a pine tree over a river, right? And it's similar for pollinators. They're looking for different types of habitat. And we're going to talk about habitat for overwintering a little bit, and you can get more information from my article if you want, but it's very important for pollinators that they have habitat in your yard to overwinter. And we'll talk about that. So every animal is looking for a different type of habitat, and you can provide that. This is an example of a commercial property. It's actually a library in Nottingham, and some of you may know it. This is the Blaisdell Memorial Library in Nottingham. And again, if you look at this, take a look at this and think to yourself, what is it that you like about it? For me, I love the fact that it's not a straight path to the door, that it's just like, it's organic. And that feels good to us because we're organic. And then you have a bit of lawn, so it looks kempt, but you also have, again, flowers, layers. You have structured different textures, and you have conifers and you have deciduous things. So you've got many of the different elements of food and shelter that are going to be needed by pollinators and other wildlife. And it's pretty. And I can tell you, I've gone to visit it in Nottingham. It's 40 minutes from my house at different times of the year just to see what it looks like. And it's pretty at different times of year. And it provides habitat. Again, it provides food because there's fruit-bearing shrubs back in there, and it provides shelter throughout the year, provides seeds for birds in the winter. So that's a really good example of natural landscaping on a commercial property. So even if you have a small property, you can do things in your town to, you know, government building areas, schoolyards, etc., that are like this. So you saw in the previous picture that there was lawn, and I mentioned lawn in the beginning. And Doug Tallamy, again, this famous entomologist who does all this research, in his first book, you know, 15 years ago, asked us to reconsider our lawn. And he basically said that every weekend in the United States, we mow 8 times the size of New Jersey, and we mow it down to 1 inch. So in that book, he said, could you reconsider your lawn and think about substituting something else for your lawn instead, so that it's not a monoculture of one thing that's not going to help. And I'm going to share 3 or 4 different ways that you can do that. Again, typically less work for you and your husband and wife to do. Lately, in the new book that Doug Tallamy has done, his 3rd book, he has a new concept. It's not just reconsider and reduce your lawn. He has a very specific challenge for us. He has asked us each to reduce our lawn by 1/2. And he has really good data to back it up. He basically said, look, he's done the numbers. If we all reduced our lawn by 1/2, not only would we have unfragmented areas that these little animals can move around instead of them being isolated in our national parks, we're bringing nature back to us, which I think we're all interested in doing because we're on this webinar tonight. But the amount of space that we would rewild would be 20 million acres. And 20 million acres is the size of all of the national parks in the contiguous United States. 20 million acres. If we each just took half of our lawn and made it native or just made it not lawn. And again, I'm going to share some ways to do that. So it's a really good challenge, and Homegrown National Park is what he is calling it. It's a movement. He has an Instagram feed, and you can get on the map and say, okay, I'm doing it. So the first way that you can decrease the size of your lawn is simply to not use herbicide, if you are using herbicide, and allow other things to grow amongst that single grass species. So violets and dandelions pop up. We have a lot of native violets. Dandelions are not native, but they are providing forage for in the early spring for bees and flies, etc. And what it's doing is it's creating diversity in your lawn that will create habitat and food for many different species of insects, which will include pollinators. So we encourage you to consider, not maintaining a pure lawn, but allowing things like violets and dandelions to grow in it, and clover, right? Another thing you can do is simply not mow the lawn. So my husband and I, 2 years ago, agreed to take a section of lawn and not mow it and just see what happened. So we took a 40-foot by 50-foot space, and he doesn't mow it. And we've been watching what happens there. We had a bunch of asters come up this fall. You have to mow it once a year if you're doing something like that, just to make sure that it doesn't turn into forest, because it very quickly will start, woody things will start growing in it. So if you want it to remain lawn, just mow it once or twice a year. So you can do that. You can also, this is my favorite thing, you can also change the height of your lawn. So instead of mowing at 1 inch, my husband and I mow at 4 inches. And it's magic. I'm telling you, it's magic. We have wood frogs. We have spring peepers in our lawn in the summer. I'm not kidding you. What does that tell you? You got 4 inches. At the bottom of that, that's a whole habitat there for insects and for frogs, right? It's cooler down there. It's hot and dry up here. If you're cutting your lawn that much, there's nothing that's going to be able to live in there. It's going to be very dry and hot. But if you do 4 inches, it's magic. You suddenly see all kinds of things. You can do this in an area where it doesn't look bad. If you definitely mow part of your lawn, you recreate on it, you don't want to worry about ticks, definitely keep part of your lawn as lawn. But in areas around trees or maybe in the yard edges, don't mow or allow asters and goldenrods and other things to kind of grow there. You can do that at yard edges. People in New Hampshire actually do this a lot. If you're not doing it, you probably have neighbors that are doing it. And you know what? That's great. If there's a whole section of the front yard or kind of the median strip that's like that, that's really good habitat. And what about those parts of the yard that are shady and you can't get any grass to grow? Don't grow grass there. Change it to a little native shady habitat. So you can put in native plants like ferns, like this beautiful hobble bush on the left with the red berries. You can have all kinds of native plants that need shade, that will thrive in shade, and you will have yourself the most beautiful little oasis. Put a little bench there, go out there on a hot summer day with an iced tea and enjoy it, or maybe an adult beverage, whatever you like, and enjoy it. That's what you can do. I mean, that's some of the ways that you can kind of reduce the amount of your lawn. And I've been in the process of doing that, as Diane said, for the last 3 years. And it's a somewhat slow process, but it is extremely rewarding. And the last thing you can do in your lawn is to create a meadow out of part of it. What I described to you is a grass meadow. I am now turning that grass meadow into a wildflower meadow. And UNH has some excellent research on and some techniques on how to do that. If you're doing a wildflower meadow in part of your yard, that is actually a 3-year process. Don't expect that it will happen overnight. It takes a while because our native wildflowers, they need to, be cold stratified over the winter. They come up as very small plants, building their roots in the first year. They flower in the second year, and in the third year, they come up in all their glory. So if you have a 3-year time window, and who doesn't these days, consider doing a wildflower meadow in your yard. And again, UNH has some great resources and tips for how to do that. So I've talked a lot about lawn, 5 different ways that you can reduce your lawn. Let's talk about other things on your property that you can do. You probably have trees on your property that have holes in them and have cavities that you may not even know about, because sometimes they're not visible to us, but a lot of trees actually are hollow. And this is an example of a cavity on a shagbark hickory. This shagbark hickory actually is providing shelter in multiple ways. It's got a cavity, but it also provides shelter underneath the bark. Did you know that some of our native bats will roost underneath the bark of the shagbark hickory? It's true. And I learned from a podcast this week that there are 43 species of animals that will actually reside in a hole, a cavity in a tree, from birds to different animals all the way up to fishers. So a very important thing to have on your property. If you have it, value it, treasure it. And if you have a tree that's going dead or is dead, if you can leave it on your property as they call it a standing tree or snag, that is a wonderful thing too, because that's part of nature. That's going to be decaying over time, and the insects will be getting at it. And then you're going to have woodpeckers, eating the insects. And then it's going to turn into tremendous organic material, which is going to be great for amphibians and insects and pollinators and shelter for many different species. So cavities and snags. Many of you probably have nest boxes for bats or bluebirds or owls or ducks. If you're doing nest boxes, I just encourage you to please do your research. It does require you to be a parent of sorts. There is a responsibility that goes to having a bluebird nest box to ensure their safety. So if you're thinking of doing it, please do the research first and be committed to maintaining the bluebird box and making sure that they're safe from their predators, if you will, the non-native predators, specifically the house sparrow. So you can also plant a log. So we all have trees that come down. They're old, they get hit by lightning, the windstorms, the snowstorms, ice storms. You can plant a log, which is what my fellow natural resources stewards are doing in this picture. They're actually putting it into the ground. Well, why would you do that? Because it's habitat. It's going to provide food for some insects. It's also going to provide great shelter for amphibians. Think about the redback salamander you see in the upper right here. You're definitely going to find different types of species of red eft, which are, typically when you roll over a log, you can almost always find a red eft, which is the terrestrial form of the eastern newt. You might see mice or snakes and various other things using the log. And if it becomes hollow, it's a cavity also that other animals will use. Now, many of us have brush piles, and I know I used to worry about getting rid of the brush pile, but I'm here to tell you, you don't have to worry about getting rid of the brush pile. You can leave it right where it is because it's habitat. It will not only support many different types of mammals, but it also will support many beautiful types of birds. One of my favorites in the spring is the white-throated sparrow. They nest in piles of brush like this that occur in nature. So I've seen them in brush piles on my property and also on Southeast Land Trust property in their woods. Everybody loves the sound of the the white-throated sparrow, which I've been hearing the last week because they're here for the fall, they're back for the fall. Just beautiful. So brush piles can be good. Don't feel bad if you have a brush pile. You're helping nature, right? Now I mentioned that pollinators need to overwinter, and there's many different ways that they do that. Many pollinators and insects rely on the ground, and specifically the leaves that are on the ground. We call it leaf litter. And we encourage people to keep the leaves on your property if you can. If you need to rake it off of your lawn, that's great. Try to rake it into your wild areas, underneath your bushes, in your garden. Those are not only valuable as mulch and resources for the earth naturally, but they also provide shelter and sometimes even have these very desirable and beneficial insects in the leaves. So think about it this way, and Doug Tallamy explains this in his new book. All the trees that have 400 species or 100 species of caterpillars in them, many of the caterpillars turn into chrysalises, and many of them overwinter as chrysalises. Okay, some, like the mourning cloak, overwinters as an adult. But let's say it's a chrysalis or a cocoon. They attach themselves mostly to a leaf. The leaf falls down. That means that in the leaf litter, we actually have next year's butterflies and moths, right? So think about that when you're raking up the leaves, and think about the fact that there are next year's butterflies and moths in that leaf litter. If you can keep it on your property, maybe tuck it underneath the tree that it came from, you're likely to have more butterflies and moths next year. The queen bumblebees, about this time of year, they have just found, the new queens have found their new home. We believe that they find a place underneath leaf litter and maybe even in the ground to stay over winter. Many species actually do that. They go underneath many layers of leaves. I found a woolly bear caterpillar last week when I was digging around some leaves and making some more pollinator area. So you also, if there's too many leaves, some of us have too many leaves. If you have oak trees and a lot of maple trees, it may be too many leaves. It's okay to compost them. Compost them and make that black gold that you can use in your garden. You don't have to go and buy mulch or soil or compost if you're using what's already on your property. So we're advocating that you basically skip fall cleanup. It's less work and it's helping nature. And there's one other thing you can do that's also less work, and that is skip cutting down all the perennials. This is a traditional thing we do as gardeners. We tidy up the garden. We like to say that we're going to tuck in the garden. Tuck things in, but don't cut everything down, because bees and others actually overwinter inside the hollow stems of the perennials and our canes, like raspberries and blackberries. Think about things like elderberry that has a soft pith, or swamp milkweed that also has a soft pith. There are bees that are going in there and they're overwintering in there. If you cut it down and throw it away, they may not be able to get out when spring comes. So leave it be. You're also leaving the seed heads. And in the winter, you have your winter garden, and you're going to see goldfinches and other birds coming to eat the seeds in your garden. So you will actually have animals coming in the winter as well. You have a scene like this where it's not just trees, but you have some standing perennials and shrubs and some food and perhaps some habitat underneath all that snow. All those pollinators are snug as a bug in a rug underneath the snow and underneath all the leaf litter that you kindly left for them. So I'd like to, again, pause and ask Diane if you have any more questions that we can answer related specifically now to either food or to shelter and cover.
So you got a lot of thumbs up for leaving parts of your lawn. There was a lot of enthusiasm in the chat box about that. One person asked about, I've heard people talking about moss lawns instead of grass. Is this beneficial?
I haven't heard of that one. I'll have to give that a pass and say I'd have to Google that and look it up, or it's a good opportunity for me to give a plug to UNH Extension. The Master Gardeners have a line that you can call or email, and you can ask them virtually any question and they will look it up for you. And I give the information on how to reach them later on in the slides, but I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, so I've heard that leaves, if they haven't been chopped up, can mat up and prevent water from getting into the ground.
That can be true if there are a lot of leaves. And that's what I said, in some cases, if you have like oak leaves, there are some leaves that are more difficult than others. But generally speaking, if you think about woods, you know, in woods, you typically have a layer of a couple of inches of leaves and it's fine. So I think the problem really comes if you're trying to mat and it's like, you know, 8 or 10 inches. That's probably too much for the lower layer to really deteriorate over time. But I'm not an expert on that, so it might be worth checking out. But I can tell you that if it's a couple of inches, it should not be a problem unless you have maybe something like a black walnut or something that you may not want the leaves to be in your yard.
So Vicki, if you only mow once or twice a year, what time of year is best?
Awesome question. I didn't know the answer to that either, so I had to do the research and look it up. So obviously, you don't want to disturb the habitat of animals that are breeding. So spring and summer are bad. You don't want to really do it in spring and summer when there's going to be pollinators and all kinds of animals there. And it's also forage for different animals too. So ideally, you would do it after what Xerces Society recommends is after October 1 for most of New Hampshire, because after October 1 is when all the monarchs, for example, have started to migrate south. So they don't need the milkweed and aster and goldenrod anymore. And then you can also do it very early in the spring, so like April or May timeframe before things get going. So those are the two times when farmers have fields and they're trying to maintain a pollinator pathway. They generally try to do it like mid-October, early November, and do it like that once a year. And then they feel pretty safe that they've gotten the woody material, but they've also protected the biodiversity as much as possible.
Great. So when would you clean up in the spring?
I don't really clean up myself too much in the spring. I guess in the spring, oh, actually there is a good answer for that. So you have the overwintering insects that are in the stems, right? So the bees are in there and the bees are not going to come out until, from a phenological standpoint, they think it's the right time. And they do that by, we think, by temperature. And it appears as though if you have 5 days in a row that are 50 degrees and sunny, that all the bees that will have overwintered in there will be out of those stems. So generally we say don't cut, you know, the stems of your perennials in the spring until you've had 5 successive days of 50 degrees. If you need to cut before that, you can cut them, put them in a bundle and lean them up against a structure so they're still sticking up, and put them on a sunny part of the house or side of the house or whatever. And that way the bees that are in there could still get out. You'd still enable them to escape and, you know, begin their lives, right? If you have to cut before you've had those successive 50-degree days.
Great, thanks. So there's a question, can you talk more about the Pollinator Pathways program?
Sure. So Pollinator Pathways is a worldwide effort. There's Pollinator Pathways everywhere. There's a big effort in Connecticut, and Evie, Nathan, and Margie Bean and I started it in 2018 here in conservation commissions in Rockingham County. Over 500 people on Facebook and over 500 others said, yes, I'm going to do things to support pollinators. And the 3 things that we ask you to do, plant native plants, try to avoid chemicals, and one other thing which is not coming to me, herb pesticides, plant native, and take out invasives. Those are some of the big things that you can do. And if you're willing to do any of those things, then you can be part of the pollinator pathway because you are supporting them.
That's great. Thanks, Vicki. And one more question.
That varies by species. Some of our early bees, the mining bees, for example, they come out really early in the spring. And in the middle of the summer, they've already nestled away. They basically, their life cycle when they're active is earlier in the year. And then we have some species that are much, just like birds. Think about the fact that, goldfinches and cedar waxwings, they nest later because of their food source. So the different bees and the different butterflies also have different kind of life cycles. So thank you, Diane, and thank you again, everyone. I'm going to move on to the third aspect of habitat, which is water. If you're lucky, you have a source of water, a pond, a lake, a stream, a seep of some sort on your property, but not all of us are that lucky. And I'm happy to tell you that you don't have to create a pond. You don't have to, dig one out. You don't have to get the liner and create a pond. You can do things that are much more simple than that and be just as effective at attracting pollinators and other insects. Remember, pollinators can't drink from a bird bath. And even a hummingbird doesn't drink from a bird bath. They have to fly through a mist, right? So you can do something as simple as a butterfly rock. And what is a butterfly rock? It's simply a rock that has a little impression, a little indentation that water gets held in there. Or you can create a bird bath, or a bird watering area and put a lot of rocks in there so that there's areas that an insect can land, a beetle, a fly, one of our flower flies, a bee, a butterfly, they can land and they can get water if they need it without potentially drowning. So there's all kinds of neat things on the web that you can look at of things to do there. But it can be, like I said, as simple as a cool rock that's got an indentation. And then you'll see the insects go to the edge and very carefully just dip their proboscis in and get some water if they need to get it. So it's very easy to do. I can tell you, I personally think this is the best thing I ever did in the yard. The single best thing I ever did was to add water in multiple locations in the yard. But the first time that I did it, I couldn't believe the change in the species I saw across the board. And then I added a heater to the water for the winter. And that was magnificent because when you have several days in a row where everything is frozen, you'll have a February day like I did 2 years ago when first 6 and then 7 male bluebirds all arrived at once. And while I was eating lunch through my glass door, I was able to see them on the water splash, basically having a ball because everything was frozen. But they found water and they told their buddies. There were 6 first, and 45 minutes later, they left, and 45 minutes later came back and they had 7. So they told another buddy, come on, we know where the water is. Let me tell you, that was magical. So having water of some sort, it can be something as simple as the condensation on your rain barrel. So if you have a rain barrel and it has water in it, on the part that's close up to the house or if it's in the shade, it's going to be condensing. Animals will get water from that. They don't need a lot. And you'll also find things like frogs might also find habitat and shelter in there too because it's cooler and it's wet, it's moist. So again, if one of the principles of permaculture is to observe. And it's really important to just go out in your yard and see what you've got, take an inventory, be as type A or not as you like, but write down what you see, understand which parts of your yard get, full sun 6 or 8 hours a day, which parts don't, understand the types of soil that you have. When you do that, you'll be able to match a plant that's native to that area and you will have success. You will have a plant that's planted in the right place. And it will thrive. There are plants that love what we call wet feet, so if you have an area that floods, a lot of us have wetlands in our yards, and there are beautiful wetland obligate plants that thrive in wet, in wet feet and wet areas, and they are perfect for the pollinators. Swamp milkweed is one, Joe Pye weed is another. There's, button bush and plethora alnifolia. So many wonderful native plants and shrubs that you can that you can put. There's all kinds of information that you can find from UNH and others about plants you can put in a rain garden that are specifically made to be flooded, because you're going to have a lot of water there, and they can be just beautiful, aesthetically pleasing. So that's water. I do have a few other things I'd like you to consider as we look again at this example of a shady area. You may say, well, geez, you know, this is all great, but I don't know where to start. I just don't have a clue. And I wanted to share that there is a really great book. This book, Integrated Landscaping, you see it on your screen in the upper right. UNH did this book. Two of the teachers of my natural resources stewards are authors of this. It's incredible. It gives you some basically plans, 12 different or 8 different models like this one, and different ways for you to consider how to put plants together in an area. So it's very helpful. And it goes through a lot of these basic principles. It's a great reference. And it's a book that we are going to be giving away if you want. If you're the winner, it's one of the books you can choose from in the drawing for filling out the survey. But native plants can be truly beautiful. They can provide color, they can provide food and habitat that can be aesthetically pleasing for us as well. So we talked a lot about native plants and their value to supporting pollinators. In fact, not just the value, but their necessity, right? And then someone asked that great question about burning bush and barberry, these non-native exotics, we call them. We call them invasives, not because they are just aggressive in and of their own. I mean, I would say poison ivy is aggressive, right? Or invasive, but it's not invasive in the way that we're talking about in this discussion today. Because poison ivy is native. It plays well. It won't pull down a tree like Oriental bittersweet does. But poison ivy is a great source of food. A lot of animals eat the berries. We can't eat them, but lots of animals do, not just birds. So what can we do about these invasive plants? We know they aren't good because they're plants in our yards, right? And we know that they also spread prolifically. The multiflora rose, a single bush, can produce 500,000 seeds in one season. Think about all those in your seed bank. Autumn olive, all of Oriental bittersweet. These are all producing seeds that are going to stay in our soil for a long time. And we don't want them there because we want the natives. So Japanese barberry is an example. Oriental bittersweet, which pulls down trees. We've all seen that happen. It's so sad. If you have burning bush in your yard, I would recommend, if you can remove it, to replace it and bring in a native, beautiful blueberry, a high bush blueberry, which has, in my view, absolutely beautiful color. And you're seeing it. You're seeing it now. We're seeing this beautiful color of the blueberries along shores, especially. If you have Japanese barberry or European barberry, you can replace that with 9-bark, which has these beautiful purple flowers, right? If you have Norway maple and you take down the Norway maple, we have beautiful maple species. How about a red maple or a sugar maple? Just as beautiful, perhaps more so in the fall. So you can replace the invasive species with native ones, and you're adding a lot more, food and shelter and diversity to your yard and attracting what you want to attract. So I'd like to share with you an example. It's often helpful to kind of see a before and after. So here's a before and after. This is a public property in Manchester, and they wanted to redo it because no one was using this area at lunchtime. There were a couple of benches, but no one went there. It wasn't very kind of pleasing, and wildlife wasn't using it either. So they used the integrated landscaping book, and they worked with master gardeners from UNH as volunteers. And what did they do? They redesigned it. Before, there's a pin cherry in the middle and not much else. After, the pin cherry's in the middle, and you have this beautiful organic walkway. So you can just kind of take a little bit, it's almost like a labyrinth, isn't it? You can walk around there, and then you see all these native plants that have been added, mulch around them. In 3 years or so, these plants will grow and they will fill that space. And the idea is that as they grow, you won't need to put mulch down after that first year because they're going to create their own mulch and they're going to fill that space. We should only be buying or using mulch when we're first doing a planting. And we want to protect the soil. And you protect the soil because you want the microbes that are beneficial to stay there, and you don't want the rain and things to kind of, you know, send it away. You want to keep it there. So this is a beautiful transformation and something that, you know, you can do with help and with some guidance. So looking at this photo again of this wonderful natural landscape, I hope that you've come up with some ideas of ways that you can make changes in your yard and add some of that diversity in all those different layers. You will have spiders in the long grass, perhaps. You'll have some turtles walking across your property, maybe even laying eggs. You'll have owls in the evergreens, and you'll have pollinators on your flowers, and turkeys will eat the grasshoppers in your tall grass, and you'll have catbirds mewing around, and cedar waxwings eating your berries, and frogs. All of this is possible by making a few changes, and everyone can do it and have a very positive impact. So I would like to ask you to reflect on what you've learned and ask you to consider what it is that you would do in your yard. What changes will you make? And you can pick more than one, but please pick one. Please commit to doing one of these things in your yard over the next year. And you have time now, you know, to plan and start thinking about how you can do that, where you might want to do that, maybe doing some observation, maybe doing some research, maybe calling UNH. So I see that about 30 of you have voted so far, and it's pretty evenly matched, actually. We have a clear winner. I'll be able to show you in a moment. All right, this is awesome. I love the fact that so many of you are doing different things, planning to do different things on your property. So I'm getting ready to close the poll. If you want to vote, please do so. I'm going to be closing the poll. I think I'll end polling now. So with 51 of you voting, the clear winner is adding native plants. So I'm so glad I've made the case. Probably most of you knew about native plants anyway before this conversation, but I'm glad that you agree that that is something that you can do. It's not that hard because you can find a plant in an area that is going to thrive and do well, and you will be able to attract the pollinators and other animals there. Avoiding chemicals. A third of you said you would avoid chemicals. A third are going to add water, which is really pretty easy to do. Remove the non-natives. More of you are going to add layers, and a third of you are going to, a little more than a third of you are going to reduce the lawn. So let me summarize a quick summary of the 10 things, top 10 things you can do. Number one, add wildflowers that are native to your area. Whether you're in Pennsylvania, I know someone here is from Pennsylvania, welcome, or in New Hampshire, find out from your Native Plant Society what the native plants are. And I'm going to be giving you a list actually in the resources that Mark is going to be sending to you by email, a list of native shrubs and trees and perennials that you can add. You can reduce the lawn, you can replace the non-natives, you can skip fall cleanup or reduce it immensely. Keep that brush pile, make it bigger. Ours keeps getting bigger, I admit. Add a nest box or two, add water, avoid chemicals, and then most importantly, you've just spent all this time thinking about ways to bring nature back into your yard. Please take time, go out into the yard, put a bench out there, take your binoculars, sit out there, listen, smell, and watch. And you will be amazed at what you have created that you're going to want to do more. You're going to be like me. You're going to say, I want to do more. And you're going to want to keep doing more. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and let you know that I am available now for additional questions. I also encourage you to please email me if you have questions. I'm always a resource as a volunteer of UNH, very happy to help or to try to put you together with the right resources. And remember, please fill out the survey because we want to know how we can make these webinars better, how we can meet your needs better. So there is a drawing of these 3 books, all of which I recommend. Really good books. All right. So I want to thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it back to Diane, and we're going to see if there's some other questions I can answer.
Thanks, Vicki. That was great. And there are a few questions here that I will share, and then people probably, after we finish this, if they want to raise their own hands, we could probably do some of that as well. But going back to water, there were a couple questions about that. One asked, how do you have water and not mosquitoes?
That's a very common question. So mosquitoes breed in standing water. And so the most important thing to do is to remove your property and areas around you of any, tires or pots or anything that are going to be holding standing water. Just turn them upside down. If you have a bird bath and a water source, you just have to replace the water every few days. I believe I looked it up in the life cycle of a mosquito. Once they lay the eggs are, I think, 36 hours. I thought it was a week, but it's actually shorter than that. So just replace the water every few days and they won't be able to come to fruition.
That's great.
Yeah.
Can you recommend specific products to buy to keep the water from freezing?
So there are a few different, so I would just recommend, I'm trying to remember the name of mine, but it's basically I tried 2 different techniques. So the first one was a little heater that actually went inside of any unit of water you might have. And that worked for a season, but it didn't last. It didn't have longevity, if you will. What we have now that's lasted for 2 years and seems to work well is it's actually a heated bath. It's built in and it has a plug in it, so you don't add something to keep the water heated. It actually is a heated bath, and it has a power cord attached to it, and you just attach it to an outdoor extension cord. I do know that there are inexpensive ways of doing this. People who have pets and horses and things talk about the fact that there are heaters for their water that you can use that may not be as expensive as buying one specific to birds. So take a look at what's out there, look at the reviews, talk to friends, and try one.
Thanks, Vicki. So there's a question here, and I've heard this question before too. Milkweed in our field has disappeared, and I've heard this from others too. What's going on?
Do you have any insight from that viewer of why it's disappeared? Was it mowed, or did it just not come back? It sounds like it may be the latter.
So this is Sandy, and I don't know, Sandy, if you wanted to add any more specifics to that question.
Can you hear me? I think I unmuted.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, we have a field and we would get it mowed every 2 or 3 years. Mm-hmm. And we had milkweed there, and then it just has not reappeared. And I don't think it's from over mowing, because I was talking to some neighbors and they said that they've also noticed that their milkweed has not come back.
I would just say get some seeds and plant some more. I think they probably have a life cycle, and and maybe there was something about that location that they didn't thrive. I don't know how many years they were there, but
many years. Is there a type of milkweed you'd recommend to replant?
So it depends on the conditions again. Right plant for the right place. If it's very dry area, then you want the butterfly weed, the orange flower, Asclepias tuberosa. If it's a wet area, you want the swamp milkweed.
Okay.
If it's normal soil, the common milkweed.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So there's a question about highbush cranberry. Is highbush cranberry native, and is it good for pollinators?
I don't know highbush cranberry. I apologize. I know highbush blueberry, but I don't know about cranberry. They're both in the vaccinium, whatever Latin name. They're both in the same family, and I can tell you, they both, blueberry and cranberry, have extremely high numbers of pollinators. They're a host plant for dozens of Lepidoptera species, both the cranberry and the blueberry, in addition to providing food to many different species too. And the flowers, of course, are good and pollinated by bees and others. So yeah, I would say that they are excellent for pollinators and a really good plant.
Yeah, as far as I know, it is a native.
Yeah.
So someone asked the question about, does UNH provide resources for free? And Ruth Smith answered that question for everybody, but if people aren't looking at their chat box, they do provide resources for free.
They do.
And they are funded through the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and really, thank you, Ruth, for answering that in the chat while we were chatting. Ruth leads our Master Gardener program at UNH. She's awesome, and is one of the many resources that are available to you. I mentioned the Ask UNH extension. Hi, Ruth. Would you like to share the phone number in the email? Because I actually didn't have it in my presentation. I'll unmute you. There you go.
Sure, the info line, which is available 9 to 2, Monday through Friday, and it is being operated now, even though the pandemic has shut down the physical ed center. Master Gardener volunteers and some staff are answering the phone lines and email. So the email is easy. It's answers@unh.edu, and the phone number is 1-877-EXT-GROW, and I'll put those in the chat for folks.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thanks, Ruth.
And I have to say that beyond that info line, UNH also has many other programs. I'm a natural resources steward. I'm also a coverts cooperator, which talks about managing your land for wildlife. They have nutrition programs. I mean, UNH is an amazing resource that people don't know enough about, and it's all free. I mean, we're paying for it. Again, it's a state resource. Extensions around the country in every state are like that. They provide valuable resources. So get to know your local folks. If you have a lot of land, you should know your county forester. We have 10 counties in New Hampshire. We have great county foresters, and they will, if you have, 5 or 10 acres or more, they will walk your land and they will help you with questions that you might have about how you want to manage that. So really valuable resources overall.
Thank you, that's great. And I think if people want to raise hands and ask questions, that would be fine. But Vicki, I just want to make sure you know that there are multiple comments in the chat box about what a great presentation you gave and thanking you for it. So in case you don't see the chat box when it ends, I want you to know that that's what's in there. So
yeah,
thank you.
I won't be able to see it. I think they go away when we end the program. So I appreciate you sharing that with me. Unless you can see somehow, Mark and Diane. That would be good, but no worries. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so if there are any questions, if people want to raise their hands, or use the reaction so we can see. Mark, can you see everybody? I can see some.
Yeah, I think everyone's questions have been answered. It doesn't seem like anyone's raising their hand or trying to flag us down.
Linda, Linda, do you have a question? She unmuted.
Let me see if I can unmute her for her. Let's see.
Yeah.
You're muted, Linda.
Linda, you're still muted. There you go.
There you go.
Is there a book other than the integrated landscaping book that would tell us what native plants and bushes and trees to use?
Absolutely. There are so many great resources. You will have in the email that Mark sends you tomorrow, you will have a link to a couple of those resources that I really recommend. One is our local in New England Native Plant Trust, which is our Native Plant Society. They have a 2-pager, which is the recommended native plants for pollinators. And it includes trees, shrubs, and perennials, and it's outstanding. The other is from UNH, and UNH, again, they have so many of these resources if you go to UNH extension site and search, but I give you a link in that email that Mark is sending that gives you the top shrubs and trees and perennials, again, for wildlife purposes.
Okay.
And as far as books go, the first book that Doug Tallamy did actually has a really good list in the back of plants, you know, but it's not necessarily specific to New Hampshire. And I'm just I'm looking at some of the other ones. I can tell you that are you interested in butterflies or bees or something else?
Actually, I think my pollinator garden is pretty good. I get quite a variety, but I'm just interested in replacing a couple of trees, and I wanted to be sure that I put something native in.
Oh yeah. That's pretty easy. So those two lists will give you that. And then also I can recommend that if you are a Facebook follower, if you go to Facebook and you follow Pollinator Pathways New Hampshire, they have a photo album that actually has made copies of resources for you that are all kinds of resources, including bloom time for some of the native perennials, bloom time and color, and various other kinds of tools. It's a photo album on Pollinator Pathways on Facebook that we created. And again, there's JPEGs of some of these different resources that we recommend.
Okay. And I always leave my my leaves, and I always leave my, I don't cut back anything, the perennials in the fall. But exactly when do you start cleaning up? Because I'm always afraid that I'm going to damage the new plants that are coming up because they'll just rot being underneath all the leaves. But I'm not quite sure when to start cleaning up the leaves.
I wouldn't. Just leave them there. It makes it really easy. They're there. You tuck them underneath the shrubs. You tuck them underneath the plants. The plants will come up through the leaves. They will. Unless you have 10 inches or 20 inches of mulch. They will.
I have terrible oaks.
Oh. Yeah. So if you want to move the leaves aside, you can, you can gently move things aside, and that probably won't, bother any of the overwintering insects if you need to do that in April or May. But again, if you wait until you have several, preferably 5 50-degree days, you're safe.
Okay. Thank you.
Somebody asked a question about where to get plants, and I didn't mention that, and I do want to address that. I think, Marie, you asked that question. I saw it pop up in the chat. So you don't have to spend a lot of money to get plants. I can tell you, Pollinator Pathways New Hampshire just had a seed exchange, which is really a seed giveaway, all 20 different kinds of seeds, a second annual. There are people, if you are part of a native plant group, like if you're part of Native Plant Trust, they have a members only seed and plant exchange. There are all kinds of plant exchanges. There is a state nursery in New Hampshire, which very few states have, that is awesome. Volunteers actually help harvest seedlings that are native to us. There's some non-natives as well, but you can get a straight species from the state nursery. They are bare root seedlings, but they go in the ground and they do quite well because, again, they're natives. And if you put them in the right place and just keep them watered, so that they don't dry out when they first go in the ground, you'll have a tree. Or even plant acorns. Doug Tallamy did that, and 20 years later, 15 years later, he's got quite the oak tree. So hopefully that answered your question, Marie. Lots of sources. And Ruth is saying, yeah, Bagley Pond perennials is also really good. The nice thing about Bagley Pond, I like them for a lot of reasons, but one of them is they will ship to you, so you don't have to drive there. When I drive to Native Plant Trust in Framingham, it's a haul. They also, besides shipping, they also do everything that's compostable. So they're actually very earth friendly. And I really appreciate that. You can actually plant the little plants in the little cardboard things that just go right into the ground.
Oh, that's great to know. But I don't live in oak trees either.
There's also a list of places to get native plants that has been curated and compiled by Pollinator Pathways New Hampshire. And again, that is available from them when they do events. It's also available on their Facebook page in the photo album called Resources.
And if I could just share that Bagley Pond Perennials has been a very good supporter of our McLean Center Pollinator Garden, and they have participated in our native plant sales, which last year we were able to have in person. And this year they helped us have one online. So huge resource for the state, but also a wonderful owner of that particular establishment. So she's really great, and I would encourage people to check her out. She has a really nice website that gives you a lot of information about plants.
Yeah.
So, and a couple people are putting in some other things. Stolen Falls in Henniker carries the line of Bagley palm perennial plants. She's also selling her plants at Agway. So Agway in Hooksett, Agway in Hillsborough, Agway in Concord all sell Bagley palm perennial plants. And somebody else is saying that Foundwell Farms, which is actually in Pembroke right now, I believe they moved, so I believe they're situated in Pembroke. They also sell native plants. They're a small native plant nursery, and I think they do a lot of trees and shrubs at their nursery. So Vicki, thank you so much. And thank all of you for attending tonight. And I just want to share or remind you, because I think we already shared, that next Thursday, November 5th, we'll have Lisa Wise, who's the Climate Adaptation Manager from UNH Cooperative Extension, and she'll be talking about gardening in a changing climate. So I encourage you to join us next week. And thank you again.